My name's Brandon Staub.
And I'm Brad O'Connell. Welcome to In Dispute Podcast, where we discuss hot-button issues in the Christian church. We're learning to listen to the Bible instead of our emotions, and we invite you to learn with us. Our hope is that these raw conversations would help lead us to truth and bring us closer to the mind and heart of God.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to In Dispute Podcast. Tonight, we're going to be talking about a big one. We're going to talk about the Sabbath, and we have so much information. It's such a big topic. It's such an important topic that we're actually going to break this down into two parts. So we'll have one this week and then one next week. So tonight, we're primarily going to talk about what is a Sabbath. What is the Sabbath in the Bible? We're going to talk about where it came from, and we're going to talk about stuff that we should do and stuff that we shouldn't do on the Sabbath. And then we'll continue the conversation next week. So, Brandon, you want to take it away?
Yeah, and please excuse my voice. I'm getting over some kind of a sickness, so my voice sounds a little rough. So bear with me. Yeah, so to just set the context of what Sabbath is, we need to look at where it first appears in the Bible, which I believe is a disputed that itself is disputed. Some people believe that the first instance it appears is in Exodus, when Moses is in the wilderness with the Israelites, but it actually appears right in the very beginning of the Bible in Genesis during creation, in the second chapter of Genesis, verses 1 through 3, which says, So the heavens and the earth were completed, and all their inhabitants. And by the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it as his own, that is, set it apart as holy from other days, because in it he rested from all his work which he had created and done. And if we look at that verse in the Greek, and those words that are used for rested, the Greek words actually, I'm probably going to butcher, I think it's pronounced Sabbath, which is actually, in English, you would pronounce Sabbath. So you could say that on the seventh day, God Sabbathed. He rested from all his work. So what we're saying here is God himself created the Sabbath after 6 days of work. He stopped and just kind of spent time with his creation. He spent time being in relationship with Adam and Eve. God himself, we see, set the example for what Sabbath should be for his people, from the very beginning of time. And we'll get into more of this next week, but I think it's important to state that a lot of people believe that the Sabbath, wasn't created until after the fall, after sin had entered into the world. So when we read this, we see that in a perfect world, in a perfect environment, before sin ever entered the earth, there was still a Sabbath rest, which means that at the end of time, when we're back to that garden state, there's going to be a Sabbath. There's going to be a day of rest. So, yeah, I just think it's really important that we know that this was something that happened from the very beginning of time, that God himself created, and set the example for men, to have this day of rest.
I just want to point out that the Sabbath, like we're making our way into Exodus next here, but um, the Sabbath is something that is so important to God, and like you just pointed out, it was even pre-fall, um, but it was so important to God that once we get into the book of Exodus, we start seeing the law come into place a little more. That He pretty much enacts the death penalty for breaking it. Um, it's that important to him. And we see later on, you're gonna get to this a little bit later here, that Jesus points out that the Sabbath was for man, like God gave it to us as a gift. Um, a lot of times we think that the Sabbath is a punishment or an inconvenience because we have to put our crazy American lives aside for one day and rest. It's for our good, it's for our benefit, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and it's so important that God invokes a very serious punishment on his people in the Old Testament for um, so I just wanted to point that out. It's kind of crazy when you think about it, but it's that important that he's willing to put that law in place.
Yeah. And I mean, as I was preparing for this discussion, I was thinking about how the Sabbath really doesn't seem to be that important in our church culture anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in fact, it never seemed to be, um, because I've been a Christian pretty much my entire life since I was like 6 or 7, and the Sabbath wasn't anything that I had ever been taught growing up throughout my church life. Like as a kid, there were no felt board Sunday school lessons on the Sabbath.
Right.
Um, I never really heard my pastor preach on it on a Sunday morning about what the Sabbath was. So I never really gave it a second thought, even though it was like one of the 10 Commandments. That's like the one that we seem to forget, which is interesting because the way it's worded is to remember the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so just it's just been in the last couple years really that I've had to take a second look at what the Sabbath is and how important it really is and how important it is to God. So
Mm-hmm.
um,
And
it's
while we're continuing to talk about how important it is, in Exodus 31, verses 12 through 17, God is telling his people that the Sabbath was going to be a sign between him and his people. So when you think about that, that's a pretty big deal, especially if you look at it from an American perspective. We're in this culture where it's just all we do is work. People work at work, they work at home, they work on their way home, they work on their way to work. I mean, they're just constantly plugged into something. They're constantly working these 80 or more hour work weeks in a lot of places. Um, and it's just what everybody does. It's our culture. It's nonstop. But God says, no, you guys are going to be different. My people are going to be different. You're going to take time away from your crazy schedule and you're going to rest. You're going to let your mind and your body and your spirit rest and refuel, and you're going to spend time with me. And it's so important to God that He's pointing out that it's going to be a sign between Him and His people, meaning the people of the world are going to look at God's people and see that we are set apart because of the way we rest.
right.
Um, and really the main two concepts we see in the Bible that we're going to be set aside is by our love, and people are going to know us by our Sabbath. So we're talking about one of the top two ways that the rest of the world are going to know that we follow Christ.
Mm-hmm. Yep. I'm going to jump back into the Bible here, and the next instance that we see the Sabbath, and this is where some people believe is actually the first time the Sabbath is mentioned. Um, they're only right in saying that this is the first time we actually see the word Sabbath appear. But it's in Exodus 16. Verse 23 says, "This is what the Lord commanded. Tomorrow will be a day of complete rest, a holy Sabbath day set apart for the Lord. So bake or boil as much as you want today, and set aside what is left for tomorrow." So what's going on here basically is that the Israelites are wandering through the wilderness, and God is daily uh, basically dropping food out of the sky for them. But what he's doing is he's only dropping enough for one day's worth for them to eat.
Mm-hmm.
So they're only to gather what they need for the day. If they gather any more than that, it's going to spoil overnight. So the Israelites are, it's ingrained in their thinking and their daily routine to gather every single day for the food that they're going to need. So what God is telling them here is that I'm creating this day of rest so that on this Sabbath you don't have to worry about going out to work to gather this food. So it's not only about not working, not gathering that food, but it's also, I believe, in a way about them surrendering to God's command and trusting that He's going to take care of them on that Sabbath day because they're used to their food spoiling if it's not all used up any other day. So in their minds, they're thinking, well, if we gather too much on the day before, this food is going to spoil overnight. We're not going to have anything to eat on the Sabbath. But what God's saying here is I'm going to make sure that as long as you do what I say and you gather enough for 2 days, I'm going to make sure that that food is not spoiling and you're going to have what you need on the Sabbath so that you can relax, you can rest, you can spend time with me, you can spend time with your family. So I think it was not just about not working, but it was also about that complete trust that God was going to take care of them. And I think we can see if we read through the rest of this passage that there are some people that had a hard time with that. They still went out and they gathered on that day, because it's, I think, like you were talking earlier, it's like so ingrained in the culture to be constantly working, that when we try to stop, we almost like have an internal meltdown. We have to work anyway.
Right.
I think we see that here with the Israelites is they're so freaked out that God is not going to provide that they go out anyway. And well, we see what happens.
We start seeing it again, in Exodus 20 when he states the 10 Commandments.
Yep.
We see it again, like I said, in Exodus 30 and then in 31. So Exodus is a big place of God talking about the Sabbath, and I think that Exodus is a lot of we're starting to get into a lot of the laws here in this portion of the Bible, and so God's really trying to put a parameter down for His people, and
Right.
the Sabbath, and it goes this way with all the laws. We have to read the laws. What we have to do as Christians is stop reading the law as a punishment and start looking at the law as from the perspective of a loving parent. You know what I mean? And so all the laws that God put in place were to do two things. They were to protect us, and they were to show us our need for His grace. And I think that, as we start seeing these, the Sabbath talked about in the law, I think God is just reiterating the importance of of that law.
Right.
But he's really slamming it on the Israelites here while they're in their wilderness.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, I was just reading the actual commandment itself. It's in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. Um, it says, "Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy, set apart, dedicated to God. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath, a day of rest, dedicated to the Lord your God. And on that day you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter or your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the temporary resident who stays within your city gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them, and he rested on the seventh day. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Like the language that's used there, like a pretty serious instruction. Like not only are we not to work, but we aren't even to cause others to work, not
mhm.
even the livestock.
Right.
And he like that's important enough to God to make it a commandment. Like you have like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, don't lie, don't commit adultery. Those are um pretty serious rules that can be broken. And then you have like the Sabbath, like and all of these things. God thinks that remembering the Sabbath is just as serious
Right.
as not murdering somebody.
Hmm.
Um,
It's
and
also
to
I was gonna say it's also interesting that all these commandments are do's and don'ts for the most part, but then you have the Sabbath is remember the Sabbath.
yeah,
It's the only one that really it's the only one that says that. Everything else is do this, don't do this, don't do this, and this remember the Sabbath. Don't
hmm
forget the rest day.
hmm
Like that's of all of them. That's the one that God says, do not forget this.
right. And I think he worded it that way because he knew it was going to be the most forgotten and the most broken commandment of the 10.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and for some reason, I think a lot of Christians believe even to this day that it's not important anymore.
Right.
Um, I think a lot of Christians believe that the Sabbath just means that's the day that we go to church.
Yep.
That's all it is.
And then go
Um,
sit on the couch and watch football.
yeah, exactly. It's or it's the day that every Christian goes out to eat after church. If we're not supposed to cause other people to work, Sunday is like one of the busiest days for restaurants
Mm-hmm.
because Christians go from church out to the restaurants.
Yep.
Um, so I mean that's a pretty direct violation of what he asks us not to do right there.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So I mean, while you're saying that, we can probably transition into the next kind of section here.
yeah,
But basically, to answer what the Sabbath is, it's a day of rest, and it's a day that you're supposed to spend with the Lord. It's supposed to be a day focused on Him, and that is supposed to be your rest. But in a nutshell, if we were to boil it down, because there's a whole lot of, I mean, there's all kinds of different podcasts out there, different YouTube videos where people are constantly saying, well, what can I do on the Sabbath? What can I do? Can I do this? Can I do this? Can I do this? And basically, in a nutshell, is um, you know, you don't work and you don't make somebody else work. Right? I mean that's pretty much the main idea of the Sabbath. You don't do work and you don't make somebody else do work. Anything that you can do any other day of the week, you don't do on the Sabbath. So that means, if you want to pull it out a little bit, I mean, that means you're not going grocery shopping, right? You're not going to the store and buying stuff. You're not on Amazon. You're not doing your dishes, you're not doing your laundry, right? You're not working, you're not doing something that you can do every other day of the week, and you're not making somebody else do work. Regardless of what their belief system is, God wants part of the Sabbath to be that we aren't just resting, but that we are giving rest to people.
Right. Yeah, we got to make sure that we're not turning it into just some kind of a religious ritual.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a perfect segue into this passage here in the New Testament that a lot of people, I think, wonder about. And it's in Mark chapter 2, verses 23 through 28. And what we see here is the Pharisees questioning Jesus about the Sabbath, why he's not reprimanding his disciples for picking grain to eat as they're walking through the fields. So, I mean, that basically is what's going on is the disciples are strolling with Jesus while or they're just all hanging out.
Mm-hmm.
And the picture I see in my head is just they're like anyone that walks through a field, they've got their hands out and they're running their hands through the grass and whatever.
Right.
And they're in a wheat field, so they're picking wheat up as they're strolling through, and they're munching, they're snacking. What the Pharisees are seeing here is, oh boy, the law says that you're not supposed to be gathering food on the Sabbath, which is what we just read there in Exodus.
Mm-hmm.
So what the Pharisees really are doing here is they're taking this directive that the Lord gave the Israelites in that moment, which was don't gather food on the Sabbath because I'm going to provide it for you. You just got to make sure you gather enough for 2 days the day before.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't part of the Sabbath law from the beginning that you're not allowed to gather food on the Sabbath. It wasn't about the gathering part. I mean, it was for the Israelites in that moment because that is what their work was during the week.
Right.
So Jesus' response is that they're looking at the Sabbath all wrong. They're turning it into this religious ritual that they're completely missing the point. They're looking at God's instructions to the Israelites in the wilderness to not gather food on the Sabbath as part of the law of the Sabbath when it really has nothing to do with the food itself. The disciples weren't gathering food as if it was their job. Like that's not what the disciples did throughout the week. They were strolling through the field with God. Like they were with God himself. They were spending time with God, which is exactly what God's intention for the Sabbath was.
Right.
Like I keep repeating, God, it was not about not gathering food. It was about being able to have a day of rest to spend with God. The only reason he gave that directive to the Israelites is because that was their job through the week. So here we have the disciples with God strolling through the field, and all they're really doing is just they're snacking on the wheat as they're walking. They're not like picking wheat as their job, like as if they needed to gather this to make it through the day.
Exactly.
They're having a relationship with God. They're one-on-one with God. They're talking with God. And just as casually as you would sit at a table and eat pretzels or chips and dip with your friends, this is what the disciples are doing with Jesus. They're snacking and they're communing with Jesus himself. And the Pharisees are just flipping out. Like you can see their blindness in this story. It's unbelievable. how they're just missing the point. So I think this is where people get hung up when it comes to the Sabbath. Is we either turn it into something that is just so religious that it's impossible to accomplish without messing it up. We just completely forget about it because we think it's irrelevant for today. And in this instance, the Pharisees are just making it so religious that it's ridiculous.
Right.
It's religious. So that's at least my interpretation of what is going on in that story there, and how Jesus is responding to the Pharisees here.
Yeah. You mentioned them spending time with God. I wanted to bring this up earlier here, but so during a sermon series, I think it was, David Asherig, who, for those of you listening, is a Seventh-day Adventist pastor out of Australia. He said this, and I thought it was pretty striking as far as what we're doing on the Sabbath, what we should not be doing, and what it's about. And this is kind of paraphrasing here, but basically he was saying that the Sabbath is like a date with God. And he said something along the lines of, if you had to date your spouse and 5 days a week, 6 days a week, you're working all day, every day, and you have 1 day a week where you get to sit down with your spouse and you get to converse with them, you get to talk about your marriage, talk about your family, talk about your future and your dreams, and it's just, that's what you get 1 day a week. What would that date look like if you sat down at the dinner table at the restaurant and you pulled out your Game Boy and you started, playing a video game, or you started texting your friends, or started doing your work email, or, hey, hold on, honey, let me just go do the dishes first. You know what I mean? Like, you would never get around to the date, and you would never have your full attention on your spouse. And he said that's the kind of mindset that we should have when we go into this Sabbath thing. It's where what it's really about is us being able to have that time with God. It's about us having that fellowship with God. And so it shouldn't be a punishment or some hardcore Pharisaic law that we're trying to follow every week. It should be something that we joyfully put things aside so that we can spend that day with God.
Right. Yeah, and there's so many things that we can do. Like, I think a lot of people, when they hear Sabbath, they think, well, all I can do is just sit on the couch then and read my Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But no, like, there's so much that you can do. Like, go outside and be amongst God's creation.
Mm-hmm.
Go hiking, or just there's endless things that you can do. I mean, some of it is sometimes staying in and just spending time with your family, and God, communing together.
Mm-hmm.
But there's endless things that you can do to rest and relax with God. And I don't know if there's anything more you want to add before we kind of wrap this up and get into what the Sabbath can look like here.
No, I mean, the other thing I would really add is, so I know in my house with my family, the Sabbath is kind of fairly new in the last 7 or 8 months that we've really dug into this and what does it look like, and really trying to be obedient to it. And so we're not perfect at it, and there's still some things where we're still trying to figure out what we can do and what we can't do, and I think God is gracious. So as you work this out, pray about it. Like, there are times where my wife and I will converse, and something will come up and we have to decide, okay, is this breaking the Sabbath, or is this something that we can do and still give glory to God over it? Is this something we can wait on? If you have kids, it's difficult, because how do you get a 2-year-old or a 1-year-old or a 5-year-old to sit down and focus on God all day? So you have to kind of work as a family and pray about it and see what kind of wisdom you come up with. Like, for example, in my house, I have a 2-year-old. And so Saturdays for us before church, we do a lot of just kind of hanging out as a family. And it's really hard for me to get him to just focus on God all day. And what does that even mean to him?
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I try to do is, well, throughout the week, he can pretty much have some TV time in the morning, and he gets to watch whatever cartoon he wants to watch on Netflix. But on Saturday, if he wants to watch TV in the morning, I try really hard to put on Veggie Tales instead of his typical day. That way, if he's watching some sort of cartoon, it's at least God-centered and it's giving godly advice and all this kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then we flip it to music videos that are of worship singing. So he still thinks that he's watching TV, but really he's hearing these cool songs about Jesus.
Yeah.
So you have to kind of improvise when you have kids, I think, a lot of times. But the point is what are you doing to try to stir in the hearts of your family members to spend time with God?
Right. Yeah, and I came up with just a couple things that if someone would ask me what should my Sabbath day look like,
Mm-hmm.
and you can add to this, Brad, because I'm sure I'm leaving something out probably, and there again, like I said, there's innumerable things that you can do, but one of the first thing on my list is to set aside an entire day. From the time you wake up to the time you go to sleep, an entire day, just set aside as your Sabbath. We said this earlier, but don't do anything on that day that is work or a chore that you would typically do throughout your week. Don't do your laundry. Don't do your dishes. Don't do your grocery shopping. Those are all work-related things that you can do throughout the week. You don't, do that on a Sabbath. The one that probably would get everybody fired up is don't cause anyone else to have to work. God is saying here, I read it to you earlier, it's in the commandment, don't even make your livestock work. So I hope I don't offend anybody here, but basically what we're doing is if we're reading this scripture here where it's saying don't even cause your cows to work.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going out to eat and we're causing our waiters, our waitresses, we're going to Walmart and we're being waited on by the clerk at the counter. Basically what we're saying is these people are less than livestock. I will treat my livestock better than I will treat my waitress because I need my food.
Mm-hmm.
It's harsh, but that's the reality of what Scripture is saying here, I believe, is that we aren't to work and we're not to make anybody else work for us. And if we're not even making our cows work for us, then we shouldn't think of people any less than that. So, yeah, don't cause anyone else to work. And then just make sure whatever that you're doing on that day includes being in communion with God. Like I said, there's so many things that we can do that we can include God in our activities, whether it's being outside, hiking, enjoying the weather, and being in the midst of His creation, or literally just resting in our homes with our families, communing with God. That's just a short list that I came up with. We don't have to make it complicated. It's not a 20-step program where you have to do this and this and this and this and this, and you can't do this and this and this and this and this. It's, just let God speak to you and direct you on what He wants your Sabbath to look like.
Right.
Just like in the Old Testament, God directed the Israelites to not gather food on that day so that they would be able to rest and just relax with Him and trust that He's going to provide. That doesn't mean that you can't cook food on Sabbath. There's a lot of people that actually, I believe, have a God given gift to cook. And I think that part of their communion with God is them practicing that God given talent and cooking. There's a lot of people that find a lot of rest and relaxation and cooking. There's a lot of people that find rest and relaxation in sitting in a garden and just working in the dirt and in their garden and making it look beautiful. So I mean, you have to use your wisdom and you have to let God speak to you, and just make sure that whatever you're doing is God centered.
No, I think you made a lot of good points. I try to, in our household, we try. Like I said, this is the last couple of months has really been focused for us, so it changes from week to week as we learn more.
Mm-hmm.
I don't I don't think you aren't allowed to like take a nap. You know what I mean? Like sometimes on a Sabbath, like we just need to wind down. Like there are times where I just need to take a nap. I
Yeah.
need to just sit down and not think. We just want to make sure we're not going. You wouldn't want to go in the opposite direction of that. And the Sabbath is not about being lazy at all. You know
Right.
what I mean? It's not about totally wasting your day away.
Yep.
And yeah, like kind of the same boat. Like I don't do my dishes. I try to make sure everything's done the day before. Grocery shopping. Anything that we think we might run out of before we can go grocery shopping on the next day, we make sure we have it beforehand. Um, Obviously you're going to have days where there's an emergency. I think if you wake up with the flu on the Sabbath, or some horrible cold, you need to run real quickly to the store to grab something like that for you or your kid. Like I don't think you're going to go to hell for that. But I think it should be an absolute. Like I don't think we should plan for that to have. Like we should have as much done as we can. Um, in that sense, I think that should be a very rare occasion. As far as the stuff outside goes, I think, like you said, you brought up using wisdom and praying about it, because what might be relaxing to one person is work to another. So for
Right.
me, I don't cut the grass on the Sabbath.
Mm-hmm.
As much as that wrecks my schedule, because it's one of my free days during the week,
Yep.
I don't cut the grass on the Sabbath because to me that's a chore.
Mm-hmm.
To me that's not relaxing. I like doing it because God created me to tend the yard, kind of thing. But it's not something that I have fun doing. It's a chore for me. So I don't cut the grass on the Sabbath in my
Yep.
house. So.
I think the only thing I could really add is just, and I said it before, is if we have to make sure that we're not creating this to be like a religious ritual.
Right. Yeah.
I don't know where it is, but I think Jesus's question again about the Sabbath, and he mentions something about if if one of your animals would fall into a ditch on a Sabbath, I mean you would pull it out,
Right.
even though that would be considered work on a normal day. Like you're not going to let the animal struggle in a ditch.
Right.
Like there's things that we can do.
And Jesus healed on the Sabbath. That
Yeah,
kind of stuff.
yeah, yeah. We just have to use wisdom and not make it into a religious practice.
Right.
So next week we're going to get into a little bit. We're gonna have to kind of take a veer off and talk about some different aspects of the Sabbath, mainly about does it matter what day we choose our Sabbath to be on? Does it have to be Saturday, or can it be another day? Or And we're going to get into the history of when it changed and why it changed, and if it really does it really even matter. Just a couple of things we're going to talk about next week. So stay tuned. We'll see you next time. Thanks for listening to In Dispute Podcast. We hope today's conversation has stirred you to seek biblical truth. If you'd like to contact us with questions, comments, or suggest topics, you can find us on Twitter at Dispute Podcast and on Facebook at facebook.com/InDisputePodcast. Tune in next week for another topic in dispute.